The hand that pulls the curtain. There is something about curtains that has always unsettled me. They're supposed to be nothing more than fabric, thin barriers between the inside and the outside, swaying with the faintest breeze. But they hold secrets in their folds. They conceal what lingers in the dark just beyond the glass. They tremble with movements that don't always belong to the wind. When I first moved into that house, the curtains were already there. Heavy ones, yellowed with age, smelling faintly of mildew and dust. Their fabric was coarse, rough beneath my fingers, and when I brushed against them, tiny particles floated into the air, catching the light like pale motes of ash. The windows behind them rattled faintly in their frames, as if eager to open, though I kept them sealed tight. I noticed the movements in the second week. At night, when the rest of the house was still and the air thick with silence, the curtains would stir. A faint ripple, a slow pull inward, as though something from outside pressed against them. There was no wind. I checked countless times, no draft slipping through cracks, no vent nearby, no excuse for that slow, deliberate tug. It would happen when I wasn't looking directly at them. I'd glance away, just for a second, and when my eyes returned, the curtain would shift. Not dramatically, not like a gust of air had caught it, but subtly. A fold that hadn't been there before. A drawn line of fabric pinched tighter, as if pulled by fingers too pale to leave shadows. At first, I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Curtains move after all. They sag, they shift, they yield under their own weight. But the longer I lived there, the more it became undeniable that something else was playing with them. I remember one night especially. The moon was full, pale light seeping around the edges of the curtain, tracing thin silver lines across the floor. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. That was when I saw it, the movement. Slow, steady, as though the curtain were being pinched at its hem and drawn back. Not enough to reveal the glass, but enough to let the moonlight shift, widening across the floor. I froze, eyes fixed, heart pounding so loud it drowned out the silence. The curtain released after a moment, drifting back into place as though fingers had let go. The moonlight narrowed again. The air smelled faintly metallic, as if the fabric had been touched by hands long stained with something that never washed clean. I didn't move that night. I didn't even breathe deeply, afraid the sound of my lungs would encourage whatever lingered beyond the glass. I stayed awake until dawn, the light of morning finally pushing away the silver. But it didn't stop. Every night after that, I noticed it again. A pull here, a ripple there, always subtle, always measured, as though whoever, or whatever, was playing with the curtain enjoyed the slow torment of revealing itself piece by piece. The smell worsened too. Not just mildew anymore, but something sharper, like old skin left too long in the damp. The faint sweetness of rot threaded beneath the staleness of fabric. Sometimes I thought I saw more. A pale line pressed against the fabric, thin and unmistakable, like a finger trailing from top to bottom, dragging its presence against the curtain until the dust quivered. Sometimes more than one. For 5 lines pressing in unison, curling at the tips, as though clawing at the fabric itself. I tried to convince myself to leave it alone, to let the curtain remain closed and never draw it aside. because a part of me knew with the certainty of dread, that if I ever pulled that fabric away, I would see something waiting. Something that had been there long before I noticed it, patient and smiling with no mouth, eager for the acknowledgement. But fear breeds obsession, and obsession breeds curiosity. One night, when the sound of fabric shifting woke me from a shallow sleep, I couldn't stop myself. The curtain trembled in the corner of the room, moving with a deliberate tug that lasted longer than usual, as if testing me. My throat was dry, the air thick with that metallic rot. I sat up, my fingers shaking as they clutched the blanket. And then I saw it, clear as the moonlight across the floor. The bottom edge of the curtain curled inward, drawn by something unseen, pulled taut. For a brief, shuddering moment, I thought I glimpsed the outline of a hand beneath the fabric. The shape was wrong, too thin, too long. The fingers dragged slowly along the curtain's edge, distorting its folds, pressing outward as if aching to be seen. I couldn't breathe. My eyes watered, my chest constricted, but I didn't move. I only stared as the hand pressed harder, curling its fingers against the curtain until the tips dug into the cloth. Then, just as suddenly, it released. The curtain fell limp again, swinging ever so slightly in the dead air of the room. I didn't approach the window. I couldn't. The thought of touching that fabric, of finding it warm where it should be cold, of feeling the texture of something not meant to exist, no. I stayed frozen until morning, when the light finally broke the spell of the night. But the next night it returned, stronger this time. The curtain shifted almost constantly, trembling, pulling inward, as though something beyond it grew impatient. The smell in the room was unbearable, thick and sour, clinging to the back of my throat. The floorboards beneath me seemed to hum faintly, as though the house itself recognized what waited outside. I tried to leave the room, but the moment I approached the door, the curtain jerked violently, yanked inward as though seized by both hands at once. A shape pressed against the fabric, unmistakably human yet wrong in its proportions. Arms too thin, hands too broad, fingers stretching far too long. The curtain bulged inward, straining the rod, and I stumbled backward, terrified it would rip free and spill the thing inside. But it didn't. It only lingered there, pressed against the thin barrier of fabric, unmoving, as if savoring the closeness. I could almost hear it breathing, though it was not breath. It was a dry rasp, like sandpaper dragged slowly across glass. I spent that night curled in the corner of the room, unable to look away. When dawn finally came, the curtain hung still, innocent in the pale light. No hand pressed, no shape lingered. Just fabric, yellowed and dusty, swaying faintly as though mocking me. I have not touched those curtains since. I do not open them. I do not wash them. I let them hang, guardians of the thin barrier between me and the thing that waits. Because I know if I move them, even once, there will be nothing between us anymore. And sometimes, in the dead hours of night, when silence presses too heavily and the air thickens with the smell of mildew and decay, I see it again. The faint curve of fingers tugging gently at the hem. The patient pull of something that has waited far too long. The hand that pulls the curtain, and I know one day it will not let go. The Feast of Shadows. There are moments in the night when the air feels too thick, when the silence seems heavy enough to drown you, when even the smallest shift in the dark feels deliberate. I learned to fear those moments because they were never empty. They were waiting. They were watching. It began with shadows. At first, they were just distortions of light, flickers along the wall when headlights passed outside, the faint tremble of a candle flame pulling silhouettes into odd shapes. Ordinary things easy to dismiss. But then the shadows began to linger. They did not recede when the light was gone. They stretched across the floor, clung to the corners of the ceiling, and pressed into the narrow spaces beneath furniture as though they belonged there. The first time I noticed something wrong, I was sitting in my living room late at night, the glow of the lamp filling the space with a faint yellow warmth. The curtain was drawn, the world outside shut away. The shadows of the furniture stretched across the carpet in perfect lines, but there was one shape that did not belong. A tall, thin silhouette against the far wall, unmoving, too sharp to be a trick of fading light. I blinked and it was gone, but the unease it left never faded. The smell came next. Shadows should have no scent, no substance. But these did. The air grew dense with it, a faint char, as though it had been burned long ago and the ashes had been ground into the carpet. Beneath that lay a sweetness, subtle but nauseating, like fruit left too long to rot. It clung to my skin, to the walls, to the breath in my lungs. Soon after, I began to hear them. Not voices, not at first. Just the shifting of weight in places where no one should be standing. The creak of floorboards. The soft scrape of something moving against the wall. A faint hum that settled into the silence when I lay in bed. The sound of breath that did not belong to me. And then I saw them. It was in the reflection of a mirror, late one night when I walked the hallway in darkness. My own shadow moved in step with me, but the others did not. They lagged behind, slow and deliberate, stretching farther than they should, peeling themselves away from the floor as if made of something heavier than air. When I froze, they froze too, but I could feel the weight of their attention pressing into me like cold fingers tracing the back of my neck. That was when I realized they were not simply shadows. They were entities. They were gathering. Every night after, they returned. One at first, then several, slipping in through corners of the house, pulling themselves across the walls and floors until they surrounded me. They did not move like people. They swayed, elongated, their shapes bending unnaturally, sometimes stretching into grotesque proportions before shrinking back to near human forms. Their edges bled into one another, a rippling sea of darkness that thickened the air and silenced every other sound. It was not random. It was ritual. I could feel it in the way they moved, in the rhythm of their swaying, in the way they encircled me. They were preparing something, and I was at the center of it. The first time they drew close, the lamp flickered and died. I was left in total blackness, the kind of darkness that feels solid, pressing against the eyes, suffocating the lungs. In that darkness, they gathered. I felt the floor tremble beneath me, not from footsteps, but from the sheer weight of their presence. My skin prickled, the hair on my arms rising as cold radiated from them, sharper than any winter air I'd ever felt. And then came the sound. Not words, not anything human. A chorus of whispers layered upon one another, each one too faint to distinguish, but together forming a current of noise that pulsed through the walls. The shadows quivered as they spoke, their forms bending and twisting as though the sound itself pulled them into shape. I realized with a sinking horror that I was not simply watching them. I was being prepared for them. The ritual repeated night after night. The shadows grew bolder, thicker, closer. They no longer clung to the walls but rose from the floor itself, forming hollow figures that towered over me. Their hands, or the shapes of them, stretched long, reaching, curling in the air just above my head. They never touched me, but the restraint felt purposeful, as if they were waiting for something. The smell of burning grew stronger, saturating the walls, coating my throat with bitterness. My skin itched with the weight of their presence, as though invisible ash clung to me. Sleep was no escape. When I closed my eyes, the darkness behind my lids rippled, and I saw them there too, waiting in the void. It all came to a peak on the night of the new moon. The house was silent, the air thick with the stench of charred wood and rot. I sat awake in my bed, my heart pounding with the certainty that something was coming. And then the shadows gathered, more than I had ever seen before. They seeped from the corners, rose from beneath the furniture, spilled across the ceiling like ink and water. They surrounded me completely, cutting off every trace of light, every thread of air. The whispers grew louder, rising into a tide of sound that pressed against my chest, forcing the breath from my lungs. The shadows moved in unison now, their forms swaying with a rhythm too deliberate to be random. A circle closed around me, their elongated arms reaching toward the center, where I sat frozen. I realized then what this was: a feast. I was not being haunted. I was being fattened, prepared. Every night they had gathered, drawing closer, testing the air, filling the house with their stench until it clung to me. They were not simply waiting, they were starving, and I was the offering laid at their table. The sound rose to a shriek, a cacophony of whispers that tore at the walls, rattled the glass, shook the floor beneath me. The shadows leaned in, their faces, if they had faces, stretching wide, hollow voids that gaped like mouths too large to belong to anything human. Their arms curled closer, closing in, their bodies pressing against one another as they formed a shroud of darkness that smothered me. I could not move. I could not scream. The air was gone, stolen from my lungs, devoured by the feast that awaited me. And then silence. Utter silence. The shadows froze. The whispers stopped. The circle broke apart, retreating into the corners of the room, folding themselves back into the walls, into the floor, into the places shadows belong. The air rushed back into my lungs with a violent gasp. They did not take me that night, but I know now that they will. The feast was not interrupted, it was only delayed. They are patient, they are hungry, and every night I can feel them growing closer again, lingering longer, pressing tighter around me. The shadows are waiting for the perfect moment to consume me. And I know when that moment comes, I will not be devoured in flesh alone. They will strip me of light, of breath, of thought. They will draw out every piece of me and swallow it whole, until nothing remains but a shadow among them. The feast is coming, and I am the meal.